Hello, and this week we begin a new liturgical year, and we begin by observing the weeks called Advent as we look forward to the celebration of certainly the birth of the Lord on Christmas Day. So I thought we'd begin with a little bit of review on the history of Advent, how it came into our Christian tradition. And in fact, as you know, there are in the Advent season 4 Sundays of Advent. This year, by the way, turns out to be the shortest Advent season, that is, in terms of numbers of days. And that's because of the calendar. Now, some ask, well, how do we determine when the beginning of Advent starts? And I'm sure you remember this, but it begins by observing the Sunday closest to the celebration of the Feast of St. Andrew. Now, St. Andrew's feast was celebrated on November 30th. And if you think of it, it happened to be a Thursday this year, and therefore the closest Sunday was this one coming up. Now that's interesting. Why? Well, because St. Andrew, particularly in the Eastern Church, is considered to be the first of the called apostles. Now I know that we are usually considering that Peter and Andrew were both called by Jesus on the shores of Galilee. But in the gospel tradition of John, one day as the Baptist, and he begins his story by telling the work of John the Baptist, Jesus passes by where John the Baptist is baptizing, and 2 of his disciples are sent by John to consider who Jesus is. And Jesus turns around as they're following him and says, well, what is it that you want? And they say, where do you live? Now that's a traditional way in which philosophers would kind of instruct their students by coming to their house. All right, one of those disciples, who follows Jesus is Andrew. And Andrew, having spent some time with Jesus, then goes to get his brother Peter, brings Peter to Jesus. So for that reason, in the Eastern tradition, Andrew is seen as the first apostle. He follows the teaching of Jesus by bringing others to him. So that's a little bit of a background. The season of Advent can have anywhere between 22 to 28 days. So this year, as you know, with Christmas falling on a Monday, there is only a 4th Sunday of Advent, but not 4 weeks of Advent. Advent traditionally began, so the stories go, with a celebration of the Feast of Epiphany. Namely, that would be the day in which the Magi came. That was the day in which Jesus was revealed to the nations as the Savior. So, in the beginning, it really was Epiphany that brought to an end, if you want, the liturgical year. And the Advent celebrated or remembered the coming of Jesus among us. Now, in some traditions, this began, so we believe, in the 6th century in Spain and Gaul, was the feast celebrating the birth of Jesus. The time before, therefore, because on the Feast of Epiphany, not only the visit of the Magi, but the baptism of Jesus and even the first sign of Jesus at Cana of Galilee were observed. So it was a major celebration. And because of that, on that day, baptisms took place. And so therefore, there was established a fasting period leading up to the celebration of bringing new members into the faith family. Now, sometimes this was known as the St. Martin's Fast. So therefore, Advent began on the feast of St. Martin, which is observed on November the 11th. So it was a long period of fasting and preparation. However, in Rome, began to observe Advent, not with such a long period of time, but had a period of 3 days of preparation on what were known as the Ember Days. And the Ember Day of winter, observed in Rome, were the days immediately following the feast of St. Lucy, who is observed on December 13th. So there's a kind of rich background here about different traditions. In the 8th century, the focus, again, keep in mind, of Advent was the coming of the Lord in the future. And so what we've used this term before, the eschatological coming of Jesus. However, time begins to change things, particularly it's really only in Rome in the 12th century that Advent is reduced by the Pope at the time to 4 weeks from the longer period, and it's divided, as we know, into 3 sections, the Advent time. First section talks about the kind of graciousness of the new age, namely the Epiphany age. The second section is material dedicated to John the Baptist, and then beginning on the 17th through the 24th of December are what are known as the days immediately from, we use here Luke's Gospel, leading up to the birth of Jesus, and uses a series of Old Testament images or Hebrew images known as the O Antiphons. So all of that is a little bit of a history of the Advent time. I know you want to know all this, but why we observe it. And the color chosen for this season is violet, not purple, although we often call it purple. But keep in mind that violet is a shading of red and violet, and it all kind of suggests a new beginning or a new time. And some liturgicalists a few years ago suggested that a new color be used during the season of Advent that would be blue, because it kind of represented the dawn, kind of seeing a beginning. But that is not caught on in the Western tradition. And so we still have violet as the official color. All right, so all of that, a little bit of a background. This week, the readings, so as we celebrate, continue to have the focus on the future. Now, really, when you think about it, there were 3 Sundays or 3 weekends that had that future dimension, namely the 33rd Sunday of the year, the Feast of Christ the King, which we observed last year, and now the first Sunday of Advent, kind of form a little triad of future thinking. Remember that last time we were still looking at Matthew's Gospel was the story of the Last Judgment, and again, a future time, an end time. So, this year, we will be looking, our Gospel guide will be that of Mark, generally believed to have been the first of the 4 Gospel traditions which we observe. Now, the original Gospel of Mark, as you know, was written in Greek, and we're not quite sure when it was written, although the experts will look at it, and there are a number of people who date it. Somewhere, perhaps safe to say, somewhere around or after the year 70 of the Common Time. Namely, that was the year, of course, in which the Roman army had destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple there. So that's a little bit of background about that. We will be looking at Mark throughout the year, but because also it is the shortest of the four gospel traditions, when we need kind of make up time, some reflections that kind of fill in the liturgical year, we will resort to the fourth gospel sections from John. And therefore it gives him, that's one of the reasons why John doesn't get a year of his own, because in so many ways he helps flesh out the time frame that Mark was unable to give. Also, we have noticed in the past, and we will see some of this as we go along, that Mark's gospel essentially becomes the structure for the two other synoptic writers, namely Matthew and Luke, in developing their story of Jesus, or their major reflection on a time frame for understanding Jesus. We will have an opportunity to look at this a little bit further as we move on through the year. All right, now, what we come to this time, and we jump immediately in Mark's gospel to chapter 13. So beginning of next time, we'll go back to the start. And that's because it has this eschatological, this future orientation. Chapter 13 of Mark is sometimes known as the little apocalypse. Little in terms of the phrase that apocalypse, again, has that future thought. The major apocalyptic work is known as the book of Revelation, or in former times, the book of Apocalypse, which is the last book, as you remember, of the New Testament. And it's important to notice that when we're exploring apocalyptic writing, that attention needs to be made to the unique images that are being used here. And usually these images require interpretation, but originally they spoke to current circumstances or situations at the time in which the work was written. Now, chapter 13 of Mark is, in his tradition, is Jesus' longest speech. We will notice throughout the Markan story that he is much more interested in action than he is in talking with regard to what Jesus does. So, all of this, again, is a little bit of an introduction. Having said that, and I have to kind of point out that at the end of this coming liturgical year, so moving all the way to the 33rd Sunday after or in the regular time, we'll use the first section of chapter 13. So I mention this because as we begin, we're going to use verses in chapter 13 of Mark, verses 33 through 37. The other scriptural readings assigned, first reading comes from Isaiah, chapter 63, and here we get a little jumping around, verses 1, verses 66, 1 through 66, and then Isaiah 17, verses 19b, 64, 2:7. There's a whole conglomeration here because we're putting together some teachings from Isaiah to kind of fit what we want to be stressing on this first Sunday of Advent. And then the second reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 9, which is the introduction to this famous letter of Paul. All right, having said all of that, what are we looking at when we come to chapter 30, verse 33? Now you need to back up here, and in our tradition, we begin at 33. Some of the other Christian traditions using this particular passage of Mark, include some earlier verses. Let me back up just one verse to verse 32, and it says this: "Nobody knows about that day or hour in which the Son of Man will return, neither the angels in heaven, nor Jesus himself, but only the Father." So that's important to see for the words that we will be looking at this time, that there's an acknowledgement that Jesus will be, or the Son of Man, Son of humanity as some translated, will be coming again in glory. But when this will happen, and this is important to know, nobody knows except the Father. Not even Jesus knows when this coming again, or later tradition will call it a second coming, will take place. Only that it will, and that's important to notice, that it is what Christian tradition observes and keeps in mind as we move through the centuries, that there will be a great coming of the Lord in glory. But when, nobody knows except, says Mark's Jesus, except the Father. All right. Now, Mediterranean cultures, and this is, of course, important, as I've mentioned on many occasions to keep in mind, were oriented primarily to the present. Future events were not all that interesting. They did observe them, but were not all that important. So keep in mind that Mark's gospel, therefore, zooms in on what is present. All right. Now, it tells the story, and some call this actually a little parable that is included here in the section that we're going to look at. And the parable that we hear balances off the parable of the fig tree. Now, again, you have to go back in chapter 13 to verses 28 to 29, where Jesus observes that the fig tree is not producing the flower that it should, and it prefigures in a certain way, again, the end time when there will be this flowering. So all of this, you can see, is kind of a mix match that we make as we put together the kind of a reading for and the reflections for this first week of the Advent time. Now, the story is that a man goes away, goes on a journey, and we don't know where he's going, how long he's going to be gone. That's a popular kind of little thought. We've seen this before in the synoptic traditions about men going away on journeys, and we've seen sometimes what happens then when they return. However, as he is leaving, he gives each of his family members the commission to keep doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. Now, keep in mind here that this includes the whole family, even slaves, because, as you remember, that in this culture, slaves were members of the extended household. And so, therefore, in a family, every member is to do the work that he is assigned, or that they are assigned. And so that's, of course, the kind of background here. But then, specifically, one task person is identified, and that is the doorkeeper. And the doorkeeper's job, well, what is that? Keep in mind that many cities, although the reality of that might not always have been exactly walls. See, the doorkeeper, obviously, if you are a doorkeeper, you have to have something. Well, where is the door? Well, it's in the wall or the gate of the city, okay? And this was, of course, created by cities, villages, towns for a dual reason. We think, one, to keep out those who they did not want to enter, Often this would be animals coming in at night. The gates, therefore, would keep them out, and it served as protection for the people there. So it kept out unwanted or unneeded persons or beasts, but it also kept the people in. So at night, you didn't really go out. And remember, this is a world in which there are no street lights or any torches outside. The only light that you might see would be the moon if it were in the fullness of time of the season, or if it weren't, well, you could see going out at night outside the city could pose problems for you. All right. Now, what is the message here is that the gatekeeper, and as I say, his task is to it's kind of like a 24-hour task. Some of you say that's my job. Well, but because to watch in the daylight to see who was coming, to invite strangers in or visitors, and make sure that they're all right and that it's safe to let them in. And then, of course, at night, well, still there needed to be a watchfulness. And as we hear this reading, 4 times are described: late, midnight, cockcrow, or early. Now this varies. We do believe that cities probably in this time that we're looking at followed the code of the Romans, who clocked nighttime into 4 sections. So night began 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 3 p.m., 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. So in the perfect equation, 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night. And as we've mentioned on other occasions when looking at the reality of what we call a vigil, the day began with the night from the Jewish point of view. So it's better that the darkness gives way to light rather than light to darkness. And again, that's another image that's brought to our attention in the readings this time. So the commission to the gatekeeper is to be aware, to stay awake. If there's a term that appears throughout the reading this time, it's look out, don't fall asleep, keep awake. Now, this admonition is given obviously to the gatekeeper, but it is extended to all the workers and to everyone, that they be about their task when the, master in this case, returns. Now, what if he would return at midnight or at cockcrow? Now, there's an interesting phrase that is used here. Cockcrow would be about 3 a.m. In the morning. And a careful reading about this gospel, namely the Gospel of Mark, will notice that cockcrow image also appears later on in the story of the arrest of Jesus. And remember that it is Peter who has said, will say, oh, I don't know who Jesus is. The cock crows and Peter remembers. So there is always a kind of, what we will call, and we will notice this on a number of occasions in Mark, a series of bookendings. You get the beginning, like, book holders that keep the books in place. Well, is this one of those? There are some interpreters who kind of see this. That perhaps is another story. Now, why would a guy return in the middle of the night? It is an interesting observation. As I mentioned, travel was very difficult at night. You had to know really where you were going. Why would a person come at this time in the morning when it is so dark? Well, we're not sure, but anyway, that's a possibility, so stay alert and be ready. All right, let me say that what we do now with this parable is apply what we call allegory to it. Some interpret it allegorically. The man goes on a journey. Who is this? Jesus. What is the journey? He is going to the Father through his death and resurrection. All right. The servants and the faithful are to stay ever alert. Who is that? Well, all who believe in the teaching of Jesus and in the message of the gospel. So we are not, metaphorically, keep in mind, that's how we're interpreting this as an allegory, not simply to be idly awaiting for the return of Jesus, for there is much work to be done. So the gatekeeper's watchfulness is required of all. And the master does not want to be pinned down as to when he will come. So Jesus, therefore, will come again. That is part of the tradition. But when, again, nobody knows. Now, is there a theology here? Okay, yes, some would see this. This is the age that is like the night. The age to come will be like the day. Jesus will come, and here an interesting phrase, like a thief in the night. And in his coming, darkness will be turned to light, bringing joy to those who are the children of the day. Will he come at the last possible minute? Well, who knows? So you see, the choice of this reading for this time is all very short, you will hear, and it goes back to the key idea: stay awake, stay alert. Be like the doorkeeper. Keep out what doesn't belong, keep in, and also welcome in that which makes a difference. Quickly, the first reading from Isaiah, who, by the way, is the favorite prophet of Mark. We will see him used many times as part of telling his story of Jesus. This section, 63, is from what is called Trito Isaiah. Remember, we said Isaiah is divided into 3 books. This section, which runs from verses 56 to 66, was written, we believe, at the time in which many had returned to Palestine from the Babylonian exile, and that in this little section we heard there's a recording of the history of Israel, how Israel has not followed always the kind of tradition that it should have, and a reminder, this is what the prophet is saying, that they are lost without God, but it is God to whom they should turn, and then they will be able to really move out of the darkness that some of them are living into the true light, who is God. So in a certain way, Isaiah's message is a cry for repentance. Therefore, come on, change your mind, get back, come on, be renewed. And it's a demand that the Lord will come down from the heavens to make the Gentile nations tremble at the presence of the divine. So again, this last section keeps a sort of universalism, that the coming of Jesus in glory will involve all creation, all nature. We will have opportunities to talk a little bit here, but just in conclusion, the coming of the Lord is not the destruction of creation, but the renewal of creation and the establishment of a new kingdom and a new reign. Stay awake, be alert. See you next time.